Hello and welcome to Real Cheating Story. As I sit before my computer trying to think of how I can tell my story, I know full well that no one will believe a word of it. I didn't accept it either when I first learned about what had happened to my father. Yet, the more I pondered his story, the more I am convinced that it must be true. Still, I struggled for a while on whether to let anyone else know, even though I'm pretty sure his story will be dismissed out of hand. I wondered if it should be recorded. I finally came to the decision that, if for no other reason, it will be a way for my children to learn a little about their grandfather. I love my father and still miss him today, 7 years later. It began 9 years ago, but I will start with my visit to the bank. For the purposes of this story, I was left cooling my heels in one of the bank offices by the bank manager. He was off having the bank's attorney confirm the court order declaring my father dead. While I waited, I pulled out and reread the note delivered to me a week ago with a safe deposit key. It was in my father's handwriting, but the piece of paper only had the bank's name written on it. Still, this was the only communication I had had from my father in the last 7 years. The court order would grant me access to my father's safe deposit box, a box I never knew he had. I can't believe it's been 7 years since my dad disappeared. Some people think he was murdered, others are sure he died in an accident and that his body hasn't been found yet. Still, others feel strongly that my father ran away to escape his ex-wife. That's the most ridiculous of all the theories. My father loved his ex-wife with all his heart. I couldn't imagine him running away from her. But in truth, I had no idea what had happened to my father. It was as though he had just vanished from the earth. I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Jake Stanton, and my father's name is Mike. I'm here today in the bank because of two events that happened one day apart. A week and a day ago was the 7th anniversary of my father's disappearance, which meant that my father's estate could finally be probated. The second event, which happened the day after the 7th anniversary, was the delivery of a safe deposit key with a note from my father. As I mentioned, he had rented a box at a bank that I had no idea he had ever used. It was 3 counties over. The reason for the delay in visiting the bank after receiving the safe deposit key was the necessity of providing proper documentation from the courts. Now, I'm sitting in some manager's office while they verify this documentation. I have to admit, I am beyond curious about what my father could have left in this mystery safe deposit box. I already know that my sister and I are the sole beneficiaries of our father's estate. It bothers me that my sister, Tanya, is acting as co-trustee for my father's holdings. She betrayed our father, and now she's making noises about forcing the sale of the Rain Ranch. I don't even know whether she can force the sale or not, but it has me worried. I've learned from my attorney that once the IRS gets involved, the sale of the ranch will probably be forced. Even though this isn't Tanya's fault, I'm still annoyed with her. My sister and I have never really gotten along. To her, I was her stupid younger brother. She was 2 years older than me and often treated me like I was beneath her. Tanya would make fun of me in front of her friends. When I finally realized that we weren't going to be friends, I started finding ways to get back at her for all the times she had slighted me. I was 9 and Tanya had her girlfriends over for a sleepover. She told them all that she'd seen me naked and I had a tiny willy all Saturday. They would call me Wee Willie and hold their thumb and forefinger about a /inch apart, then they'd laugh hysterically. I would turn bright red. Saturday night the girls changed into their PJs and talked late into the night. When they finally fell asleep, I snuck into Tanya's room and sprinkled itching powder on their change of clothes. I also poured an extra dose on the clothes that my sister had laid out for the following day. The next morning, they ate breakfast and watched TV before getting dressed. They were planning on going to the mall and meeting up with some friends, but they never made it out of the house. As they began to itch uncontrollably, my mother was very upset with me, but my father thought it was funny. The girls were ordered into the showers and their clothes were washed twice. They were still itching when they went home. You would think that my sister would take that as a warning and leave me alone, but she never did. We went back and forth at each other, and I learned that women can be more devious than men. Both my sister and my mother proved this to me. My sister became sneakier in her shots at me. Sometimes I wouldn't catch on for a month or more. One time, Tanya took my pet lizard and put it in Mom and Dad's bed. My mom had a strong reaction, and I got punished because I hadn't secured the latch on my pet's cage. I initially thought it was my fault. The cage's clasp was iffy and required a hard push to secure it. I probably never would have caught on except that I saw my sister smirking while I was getting yelled at. In retaliation, I dropped a cockroach down her back. I still remember my sister screaming as she stripped her clothes off in the front yard to get rid of the insect. I got grounded for a week but smirked whenever my sister passed me. I really learned about how unbelievably devious women could be from my mother. Her treatment of my father toward the end of their marriage put me off women for a long time. It wasn't until I met Jenny that I started to trust a woman. Even then, my fear of betrayal almost ruined my marriage. I loved Jenny with my whole heart and soul, and despite my fears, I asked her to marry me. She agreed without reservation, but the mistrust instilled by my mother began to drive a wedge between us. In desperation, Jenny confronted me one day and told me we needed to talk. My heart leaped into my throat, and I was sure this was where I would find out that my wife had found someone else and wanted a divorce. At that moment, I was preparing to hate her. "What exactly do we need to talk about?" I asked with a calmness that I did not feel. "You are driving me crazy checking up on me all the time," she said. "If you can't trust me, then there is no future for our marriage." This accusation blindsided me. I thought I was subtle enough that Jenny wouldn't know about my checking up on her, but I knew she was right. Our marriage hung in the balance. I had only two ways to go: deny it or admit it and explain. Thank God I chose the latter. "You're right," I said softly. "I'm messed up in the head. My mother cheated on my father, lied to him, and then left him to be with my father's worst enemy. You've seen my father, he's a broken man. He tries to hide it, but he is desperately unhappy. Jake," Jenny said lovingly, "I'm not your mother. I would never cheat on you, but we need to find a way to put your fears behind you. Would you be willing to go to counseling with me?" The love I saw in Jenny's eyes right then dissolved probably half of my problems. I agreed to go to a therapist we knew from the hospital, named Margaret Hogan. Jenny set everything up and was there at every session with me. Slowly but surely, Margaret and Jenny worked me through my problems. I remember one visit where it all came together for me. The doctor asked me what my biggest fear was. I told her I was terrified that Jenny would find someone better than me. I loved her so much that I didn't think I could live if that happened. "Jake, honey," Jenny said as she slipped from her chair and knelt beside me, tears streaming down her face, "if I ever lost you, my life would be over. I promise you that I will never leave you unless you tell me to go, but please don't ever do that. I love you with everything I have." We hugged and cried for a good 5 minutes or more. After we composed ourselves, Margaret talked to us for another half hour. After that day, my fears began to quickly fade. I can't say that my trust is 100%, but I trust Jenny as much as any person can trust another. If I had to put a number on it, I'd say my faith in Jenny runs to 99.9%. I realize now that I never really trusted my mother. There was always a distance between us. I was pretty sure she loved me and my sister, but her love seemed to come after her love for herself. Tanya was clearly her favorite, putting my sister 2 steps ahead of me but still behind my mother. It was totally messed up. The first time I witnessed my mother's selfish behavior was when Tanya had the lead in a 4th grade play. Mom had forgotten about the show and scheduled a hairdressing appointment for the same time. Mom and Dad were going to the Blue and White Ball at the hospital, one of the top social events of the year. I remember seeing my sister peek out through the side of the curtain looking for Mom. Even though we never really got along, that day I felt sorry for Tanya. I saw the pain in my sister's eyes when she finally realized Mom wasn't coming. That was one of the very few heated arguments I ever remembered my mother and father having. My mother just couldn't understand why anyone was upset. My dad was so upset that he didn't talk to Mom for several days, and Tanya didn't talk to Mom for a whole week. Eventually, my father couldn't stay mad at Mom, and my mother took Tanya out for a day of lunch and shopping. It seemed clear to me that Mom was trying to buy Tanya's affection, and Tanya was completely taken in by it. I kept my mother at arm's length, but my relationship with my father was built on mutual love and respect. My father also had a special relationship with my sister. He treated her very well. If Tanya had to choose, there was no doubt in my mind that she would pick our mother. Everything I know about ranching I learned from my father, and through him, I grew to love the ranch and everything about it. Like him, I started working almost as soon as I could walk. We were very close, and the pain of him not being around is still with me today, 7 years after he disappeared. My mother's actions crushed my father's spirit and destroyed my relationship with her. I hadn't spoken to her for 2 years before my father went missing, and I haven't spoken to her since. I didn't invite her to my wedding, and I have refused to let her see her grandchildren. Jenny and I have 3 boys. I suppose it was inevitable that my mother would cheat on my father. They came from completely different backgrounds. My father was born into a large family filled with love and mutual respect. My mother, Ashley Blakely, was an only child of a very successful builder, Jonathan Blakely, and his stay-at-home wife, Carol. My grandfather, John, and his wife started the ranch, which is now the cornerstone of my father's estate. My grandfather inherited a 100-acre parcel of land from his parents. My great-grandfather had bought the property from a neighbor during the Depression to help the neighbor out, but the land had never been used. The ranch began with that 100 acres, 10 head of cattle, and 2 horses. My grandfather built their first house by himself, and they lived in a dilapidated trailer until it was finished. Little by little, they built the ranch up, and when my father started running it, there were a little over 14,000 acres and slightly over 2,000 head of cattle, as well as 25 horses and assorted other farm animals. During their marriage, my grandparents had 6 kids: Sam, Karen, Bobby, Kelly, Heather, and my dad. It was a loving family where they all supported each other. It was known that if you picked on one of the stand-in kids, you had to face the other 5. As the years passed, all the kids eventually got married and moved away, except for Heather and my dad. Then Heather was killed by a drunk driver when she was only 17. Even many years after her death, if my father talked about his sister, the tears would flow. They were very close. My father decided that he loved ranching and wanted to make a career out of it. This delighted both of my grandparents. My grandfather died of a heart attack a little over a year after my father graduated from high school. Even though my dad was still going to college, he started taking over running the ranch. At the same time, my grandmother began to teach my father about the other businesses. My grandmother died almost 10 years after my dad got married. My grandfather was indeed a remarkable man. In addition to the ranch, he also built a feed store on another property fronting one of the main roads and became a half-owner of the local drugstore. Over the years, he acquired several other businesses. To me, my dad was my hero. He wasn't a celebrity or someone rich or famous, but he was always there for me whenever I needed help and always seemed to know what I should do. I loved him as much as any boy could love his father. My feelings towards my mother changed when she cheated on my dad and left him. My dad wasn't a celebrity, but he was well known for his athletic prowess. He wasn't good enough to be a professional athlete, but he was still very good. My father was the starting quarterback for the local high school, Clifton High, for 3 years. There's no doubt in my mind that this was the beginning of his marital problems. Clifton High School's football team was made up of local ranch and farm boys, known for their brute strength. When my father was installed as the quarterback, he was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 180 pounds. He didn't have a particularly strong arm, but he was quick and smart. He practiced with his receivers at least an hour a day during the summer. By the time football practice started in the fall, my father and his receiving corps were already firing on all cylinders. If you know anything about elite professional quarterbacks, you know they need to have a powerful throwing arm, be smart, tough, tall, and highly accurate. I'm sure there are other attributes that I've missed, but these are right at the top of the list. If you watch a professional football game closely, you'll notice that the quarterback often throws the ball before the receiver makes his cut. This was something my father did with great accuracy. From a professional football standpoint, my father was too short and his arm was too weak, but what my father had was more than enough for high school football. The 2 football teams in our county were Clifton High and Chester Academy. They didn't play each other during the regular season because they were members of different conferences. However, almost every year they met in the playoffs, and the differences between the 2 teams and the 2 schools were like night and day. Clifton was just an ordinary high school, while Chester was a prep school for the wealthiest people in a 5-county area. As I mentioned, Clifton drew its players from the student body, and they were mostly kids whose parents farmed or ranched. Of course, the student body encompassed kids whose mothers and fathers worked a full spectrum of jobs, but the football team came mostly from the farms and ranches in the county. Chester, on the other hand, recruited players from the 5 surrounding counties. It was evident that they also attracted players from well outside their area. If Chester wanted a kid to play on their football team, the father would mysteriously receive a job locally, and the family would then move to one of the surrounding towns. That's how Tucker Morris came to play for Chester. Tucker, or Tuck as he was known, had started as a freshman for a high school 300 miles away. He was such an exceptional athlete that he took that team to the playoffs for the first time in 10 years. Tuck also played offense and defense. He was the school's quarterback and the starting center linebacker. Being able to play on both sides of the line was unusual. No doubt that is why the officials at Chester took an interest in Tuck. As was the custom, Tuck's father got a job as a vice president in a local bank, and so the rivalry between Tucker Morris and my father would soon start. The actual rivalry, or should I say the tension between the two, started toward the end of the summer before they would face each other on the football field. Their first confrontation came one night when my father and some of his friends decided to get something to eat at Rosie's Burger and Dog, a local hangout for high school students. This particular night, several of the Chester football players had taken Tuck to Rosie's. As my father told me, it was apparent that the Chester students had been drinking and were being loud. Tuck always was arrogant and decided that he could do what he wanted. That described the Chester students in general. They didn't think their behavior was a problem. Tuck was acting poorly, going from table to table, grabbing fries off someone else's plate, taking a drink out of another's Coke, grabbing someone's hat, and throwing it across the room. My father probably wouldn't have done anything because Tuck was just making a fool out of himself, but then Tuck decided to harass Becky Sayers. Becky was on a date with Simon Ballard. Simon wasn't a football player, but he was a friend of my father's. Simon was totally smitten with Becky and she with him. Years later, after they graduated from college, they would be married and have 4 children. But tonight, Tuck decided he was going to confront Becky. Remember I mentioned all the attributes a professional quarterback has? Tuck had most of them. He was 6 feet 3 inches and 200 pounds, and he had a strong arm. Tuck was fast, but my father questioned his toughness as a quarterback. He had rarely been hit, and as a linebacker, Tuck was hitting running backs much smaller than him. My father also questioned Tuck's smarts, but he conceded Tuck was probably smart enough on the football field. He was on track for a scholarship to a Division I college to play football, and there was a strong probability that he would make it to the pros. Simon, on the other hand, was maybe 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds. Becky was a charming girl and smart as a whip. Both Simon and Becky would get full academic scholarships to college. While Becky was not a striking beauty, she had a notable presence. As Tuck was making his way around the room, he finally stopped at Simon and Becky's table. He stood there glaring at Becky and then reached in with both his hands and touched Becky inappropriately. Becky screamed and Simon jumped up to defend her. There was no contest. Tuck put Simon on the floor with one punch. That was all my father needed to see. He was out of his seat before anyone knew it and slammed into Tuck. My father probably wouldn't have done anything because Tuck was just making a fool out of himself, but then Tuck decided to confront Becky Sayers. Becky was on a date with Simon Ballard. Simon wasn't a football player, but he was a friend of my father's. Simon was totally smitten with Becky and she with him. Years later, after they graduated from college, they would be married and have 4 children. But tonight, Tuck decided he was going to confront Becky. Remember I mentioned all the attributes a professional quarterback has? Tuck had most of them. He was 6 feet 3 inches and 200 pounds, and he had a strong arm. Tuck was fast, but my father questioned his toughness as a quarterback. He had rarely been hit, and as a linebacker, Tuck was hitting running backs much smaller than him. My father also questioned Tuck's smarts, but he conceded Tuck was probably smart enough on the football field. He was on track for a scholarship to a Division I college to play football, and there was a strong probability that he would make it to the pros. Simon, on the other hand, was maybe 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds. Becky was a charming girl and smart as a whip. Both Simon and Becky would get full academic scholarships to college. While Becky was not a striking beauty, she had a notable presence. As Tuck was making his way around the room, he finally stopped at Simon and Becky's table. He stood there glaring at Becky and then reached in with both his hands and touched Becky inappropriately. Becky screamed and Simon jumped up to defend her. There was no contest. Tuck put Simon on the floor with one punch. That was all my father needed to see. He was out of his seat before anyone knew it and slammed into Tuck. They both tumbled to the floor and my father got 2 hard punches in on Tuck's face before the two were pulled apart. Needless to say, Tuck did not take well to his face being injured, thus the feud between them started. It only got worse before school started. Tuck felt my father had taken an unfair advantage, so in typical Tuck fashion, 3 days later he challenged my father to a fight. Never one to back down, my father accepted and agreed to meet under the Highway 1 bridge. Words spread quickly and quietly amongst the students, and at the appointed time there were at least 200 kids gathered to watch the fight. Nobody thought my father stood a chance. Tuck was so much bigger and had a reputation as a brawler. The thing about Tuck was that he was a bully. He was so much bigger than most kids his age that he wasn't used to someone standing up to him. The fact that my father had infuriated him meant he told all his friends he was going to defeat my father. Clearly, Tuck had no idea what my father was about. They circled each other as the crowd buzzed with excitement. They all expected a dramatic fight, but there wasn't any blood. Tuck tried to overpower my father and kept throwing powerful punches. None of them landed. My father kept moving in and out, and Tuck tried throwing harder punches. However, the more punches he threw, the more tired he became. My father just continued to move and throw a jab every so often. My father explained that in a fight, patience is a crucial virtue. He waited for just the right moment and then stepped in when Tuck was off balance. He drove his right fist into Tuck's stomach as hard as he could. The blow forced all the air out of Tuck's lungs, and Tuck collapsed to the ground gasping for air. The fight was over, but the tension between the two had grown dramatically. Sometime during my father's sophomore year, he discovered the girl of his dreams, my future mom Ashley Blakely. At the time, Ashley's father was a small but growing developer in the area. She had just transferred to the school at the beginning of my father's freshman year, but they didn't meet until their sophomore year. My future mom was drawn to my dad because he was a star athlete and one of the most popular kids in school. That football season, both Clifton and Chester went undefeated in the regular season. They met in the regional finals, where Chester prevailed 31-24. Tuck passed for 394 yards, and because Clifton lost, no one noticed that my father had thrown for 44 yards. No one seemed to say much about the fact that Chester lost its next game and was eliminated from any chance of a state championship. My father was smitten with Ashley, and my future mother seemed taken with my father, or at least she appeared to be. They started dating exclusively, but when Clifton lost in the regionals, somehow Ashley met and started dating Tuck. The fact that Ashley broke up with my father for Tuck was a bitter pill for my dad to swallow. After that, my father's distaste for Tuck grew exponentially. What my father didn't understand was that his future wife was quite self-centered. Even after everything that my mother did to my father, I'm not sure he would ever agree with my description of his wife. However, in all fairness to my dad, most people didn't see this side of Ashley either. When I was young, I didn't understand the distance between us. As I grew older, I studied my mother and learned what she was all about. My mother was very clever in how she interacted with people. Somehow, she managed to make people believe that she cared about them. In truth, she always subtly brought the attention back to herself. She was so good at doing that people hardly ever noticed. My mother was the most socially conscious person I ever knew. I used to think she was just fond of my father. However, years later, I realized that my mother did love her husband on some level. She may have loved my father, but she always loved herself more. It didn't hurt that my father was a very well-respected and well-to-do man who interacted in the proper social circles. The first two descriptions of my dad are entirely accurate, however, he only moved in those social circles reluctantly. Still, they included the people whose attention my mother craved. My father was not into the social swirl that my mother loved, but he went along with it because he loved my mom. He did like to attend activities that he felt benefited the community, like the blue and white ball. Ashley was a beautiful girl and then a beautiful woman. She had that stunning girl next door look with a charm that made men attentive. While she was married to my dad, I heard rumors of her having affairs. I never knew one way or another, and my father never spoke on the subject. However, if I had to guess, I'd say there was at least some truth to them. I had seen my mother use her charm on my father to get what she wanted. I had no doubt she would use her charm with other men if she wanted something. If my mother had affairs, and I believe she did, it had to benefit her. Even though my father and Ashley were going steady, my future mom found someone she thought was better, Tuck. This put her in a higher social circle, and as a result, she ended her relationship with my father to be with her new love. This first breakup hurt my dad, but he recovered. After the breakup, my dad threw himself into his work at the ranch in preparation for the next football season, which left little time for him to think about his former girlfriend. When the next football season rolled around, supporters of Chester and Clifton expected big things. Both schools went through their regular schedules undefeated, and as the playoff schedule had it, they met in the divisional finals. Once again, Chester came away with the victory, 27-24. Tuck threw for 432 yards and won the game on a last-minute pass. No one seems to recall that the defender slipped and fell on that play, nor did they remember that my dad threw for 404 yards, taking his team from the 2-yard line down the field and scoring to put Clifton ahead 24-20 with less than 4 minutes to go. Again, no one seemed to remember that with a minute and 17 seconds left, my father drove his team to Chester's 11-yard line, and on the last play of the game, my dad threw a perfect strike to his receiver at the 2-yard line. However, the receiver started to run before securing the ball, and it fell incomplete. There has been a debate for many years as to whether the receiver could have scored. I tend to think he would have, but I'm biased. No one remembered that Chester again lost its next game. Since Ashley was still going to Clifton, my dad saw her almost every day during school hours. After the initial shock of their breakup, my father started dating other girls, yet he never found one that he felt as deeply about as he did about Ashley. My dad also decided that Ashley had the right to choose who she wanted to be with, so he would stick to being friends only. Nevertheless, my father's dislike of Tuck continued to grow. My father's senior year was the best of his 4 years at Clifton. He was not only voted captain of the football team but also president of the student council. At the Halloween dance, my father and future mother were crowned king and queen of the festival. According to my dad, it upset Tuck when he saw them take to the floor for the first dance, and during that dance, my father held Ashley tight, and she didn't resist. The senior year football season for my dad was the highlight of his athletic career. It was also this game that led to ultimate disappointment later on in his life. I have thought about that year and, for my father's sake, I wish things had turned out differently. The season progressed as every supporter of Clifton High hoped it would. Once again, Clifton pounded through the regular season undefeated, and Chester did likewise, crushing every opponent by at least 30 points. The playoff brackets were reshuffled, and both Chester and Clifton ended up facing each other for the state championship. One of the reasons Chester was such a dominant team was that the coach had decided to use Tuck as a two-way player. You have to give Tuck credit for this, it had to be exhausting playing every down. My father always acknowledged that Tuck was a fabulous athlete, it was just that Tuck had a challenging personality. The state championship game was a huge deal. Not only was the game played in a stadium on the outskirts of the capital, but it was also going to be televised throughout the state. By this time, Tuck had 20 or more scholarship offers, all the biggest and best football colleges wanted him. However, he had not committed to any of them. Rumor had it that he was waiting to see where Ashley was going to college to make his decision. I doubt that's true, but women love the romance of it all. From everything I've heard, Tuck was a self-centered man, except when it came to Ashley. Even with that, I believe he would have eventually selected the highest-rated college that offered him a scholarship. Wherever he decided to go, he was arrogant enough to expect that Ashley would wait for him. There was no doubt that he absolutely adored my mother, which made him a good match for her. He was a sports hero, his parents belonged to all the right clubs, and he seemed destined for greatness. Of all the great games my father played over his high school career, his best was this championship game. It was also the defining moment when the animosity between my father and Tuck became concrete. The first half of the game was basically an offensive showcase between Tuck and my father, who combined for 680 passing yards. There was virtually no ground game at all for Clifton. This was due to the strong defensive line for Chester, mostly because of Tuck's performance as a middle linebacker. Through the first half and most of the third quarter, college coaches must have been impressed with Tuck's play. Even after everything that had passed between them, my father would always say that Tuck was the athlete with the best natural ability he had ever seen. Throughout the first 3 quarters, Tuck took every opportunity to challenge my father. This game was played before all the protections were in place to safeguard quarterbacks, so every time Tuck blitzed, he would hit my father hard. But every time that happened, my dad would pop back up and smile at him. The smiles eventually began to annoy Tuck, and he started hitting my dad late. Most of those late hits did not result in penalties, though one rare one did. It was 4th and goal at the Chester 3-yard line, and Clifton decided to go for it. The score was tied at 31-31. The Clifton coach decided that a field goal wouldn't suffice and called for a slant pass. Chester had that covered, so my dad had to scramble. Finally, he found Randy Thompson in the far corner of the end zone. My father threw the ball hurriedly and was watching its flight when Tuck hit him hard. My father admitted that he saw stars after that hit and got up slowly. When he was upright, he saw the flag on the field. Tuck had been flagged for unnecessary roughness. My father was pleased because his pass had sailed just a bit too high at the 1-yard line. The Clifton coach called 3 straight running plays. Tuck filled the gap each time, and Clifton only managed to move the ball a half-yard. The third quarter ended before Clifton's coach had decided whether to go for it or not. With the whistle to start the fourth quarter, it quickly became apparent that Clifton was going for it. Like the previous 4th down play, the coach called for a slant pass, but this time from the other side. Again, it was covered, so my dad had to scramble for his life with Tuck in pursuit. I must have watched the film of that play 100 times. Tuck was closing in on my dad, and just when it looked like my father was going to be sacked, he turned and ducked. Tuck's hit caused significant damage. My father remained upright and scored a touchdown. No one realized it at the time, but Tuck's collision had caused considerable damage. As a result, Tuck sat out 2 plays and then went back into the game, but it was clear he wasn't as mobile as before. After that last touchdown, the defenses tightened up, and the only scoring after that was a field goal by Chester. With almost 9 minutes left in the game, neither team could play conservatively. The next time Clifton had the ball, my father was picking apart the Chester secondary. Then, one of his passes was tipped at the line of scrimmage and deflected into Tuck's hands. Tuck took off down the field, but my father pursued him. An uninjured Tuck might have made it, but slowed by his injury and the perfect angle my father had taken, there was a collision at the 20-yard line. My dad caught up to Tuck and tackled him. Tuck shattered his ankle and fumbled the ball. Clifton gained possession, and Tuck was out of the game. Clifton scored once more, and the final score was 45-31. It was the first and only state championship for Clifton. In true Chester Academy fashion, now that Tuck was no longer of use, his father was let go right after his son's graduation. This did raise some eyebrows, but no action was taken. Tuck's father moved to California, and all the colleges that had shown interest in Tuck dwindled down until only one, Northwestern, was willing to give him a chance as a walk-on. Tuck rehabbed his knee and ankle but was never able to recapture his previous ability. He did not make Northwestern's team. At that point, my father lost track of Tuck. Besides, Ashley had re-entered his life. She had ended her relationship with Tuck a month after the state championship game due to his sour mood and injuries. It was a month or 2 after that before my father and Ashley reconnected. They dated while my father completed his degree in animal husbandry at the local college. Ashley went to State University but quit during her first year. She had been accustomed to being a standout in her previous environment, but at the university, she felt overwhelmed. My mom and dad were married a month after he graduated, and Ashley became pregnant shortly after that with my sister. I came along 2 years later. From what I understand, my father was extremely happy for the first 14 years with his wife. I never knew my mother's feelings about the marriage day to day, as she often changed her attitude. What really kept the peace in the family was that my father did almost everything my mother wanted, though he would put his foot down when she pushed too hard. Then Tuck came back to town. Tuck's father, who had moved to California, initially found a job with another bank but quickly transitioned to becoming a stockbroker. He did exceptionally well and then moved into a bank holding company, eventually starting his own holding company. He used his experience and contacts to acquire banks in our state. When Tuck returned, he was working for his father as an executive vice president in charge of the banks his father owned in the southern part of the state, totaling 9 banks. For the first 18 months, nothing changed. However, my mother would often point out Tuck's picture in the paper. Tuck, despite his demanding job, wanted to reconnect with my mother. Once the banks were settled, Tuck began to pursue her. The process was not lengthy. My father, trusting as he was, didn't object when Tuck asked my mother to co-chair the blue and white ball. I later learned that my mother started seeing Tuck after the first week. They continued their affair secretly, as Tuck was also married with a wife and 2 children. My father's trust had limits. He eventually began to suspect something and, despite how difficult it was for him, hired a private investigator. The investigator quickly gathered evidence. Although people sympathized with my father, they continued to socialize with Ashley and Tuck. When my father shared the evidence with Tuck's wife, she divorced him. The settlement was sealed by the court, so I never learned the details, but it was assumed to have been costly. Tuck's wife took their children and left the state. Tuck had very little to do with his children. What I remember most vividly from that blow-up was the confrontation between my father and mother. I can almost quote the conversation word for word. My mother had picked us up from school, and when we arrived home, Dad was sitting at the dining room table. My father looked at Tanya and me and said, "Kids, go on upstairs. I need to talk to your mother." Tanya took one look at our father and then our mother before racing up to her room. I pretended to go upstairs but snuck back down and hid at the bottom of the stairs. My father tossed some pictures in front of my mother. "How could you do this, Ashley? Does our marriage mean nothing to you?" My mother looked at the pictures and said, "I'm sorry you found out this way. Tuck wanted to wait until he could settle with his wife before talking to you, but it seems that isn't going to happen. In answer to your question, I guess our marriage meant something, but it's over now. It's time for both of us to move on. You've always known that I love Tuck." "Then why did you marry me?" my father asked, his voice calm but with visible pain in his eyes, even from where I was hiding. "I loved you, but I love Tuck more. Please don't make this any more difficult than it has to be." My father sighed and shook his head. The devastation I saw in his eyes lit a fire in me. If I had been asked before this day if I loved my mother, I would have said yes. Up until that moment, I did love her, but the love I felt for her paled compared to the love I felt for my father. At that precise moment, whatever love I had for my mother withered and died. "Fine, I suppose we should talk about the details of your divorce," I heard my father say in a detached voice. I was surprised at how calm he was about his wife's infidelity. "What is it that you want?" My mother gave my father a look as if he should already know. "I want half. This is a no-fault state, and I'm entitled to half of everything, including the ranch." My father surprised me by chuckling. "Not going to happen, Ashley," he said calmly. "You obviously have been taking your legal advice from Tuck." I looked it up online. "Smart," my mother hissed. "I'm entitled to half of everything." "Oh, you're absolutely right," my father smiled. "This is a no-fault state, and you're absolutely right that you're entitled to half of anything I own. The only problem with your research is that I don't own anything. The ranch, all the equipment, all the other businesses, all the cash, it's all owned by a trust. All I get is a salary and a percentage of the profits, assuming there are any. That arrangement was set up after we were married by my mother. In case you hadn't figured it out over the years, she never liked you and was only civil because of me. If you were hoping for a big payday, it isn't going to happen." I could see my mother's face harden before a sharp smile appeared. "Fine, if you want to be that way, the lawyers will handle it. Besides, Tuck is well off enough to take care of me without anything from you. I'll just take the kids and leave." I had remained hidden all this time, but my anger had been building as I watched my mother destroy my father. When she threatened to take Tanya and me, I lost it. I came charging into the room. "You!" I screamed at my mother as I came into view. "Jake, don't talk to your mother that way," my father said, clearly surprised. Neither of them had any idea that I had been listening to the entire conversation. "My father, I've always done what you've told me," I said, my voice shaking. "But today, I'm going to have my say, and I don't care if you like it." My father was speechless as I turned to my mother. It was then that I saw the photos of her in tuck. I was disgusted. "I called you a name, and I'm sorry," I said, lowering my voice and pointing at the pictures. "You're not a name I used, you're just not someone I respect." My mother recoiled as if she had been slapped. She glanced at the pictures and then at me. At least she had the decency to look embarrassed, and I was surprised to see tears begin to flow. "Jake, honey, you need to go upstairs and let your father and me finish our discussion. This has nothing to do with you." "I don't take orders from you," I said with pure anger in my eyes. My mother's facade began to crumble slightly. Looking back on that moment, I realized it was the first time she showed any emotion toward me. Apparently, she did love me at some level, but now I didn't care. It had never occurred to her that one of her children would object to her actions. Now she was faced with the devastation she had caused her own son. "Mother, I have absolutely no respect for you," I continued. "In fact, I hate the sight of you. The sooner you're gone, the better. I will never live with you in tuck. As far as I'm concerned, my mother died today." "Jake, you don't mean that," my father said, putting his hand on my shoulder. "Jake, sweetheart," my mother said, deeply upset, "just because your father and I aren't going to be married anymore doesn't mean I don't love you." "I told you, I don't have a mother," I said, my anger still burning. I pulled away from my father and started out of the room. Then I stopped and turned around. "I am never going to talk to you again, and I don't ever want you to talk to me. We're done." I stalked out of the room and up the stairs, but as I went, I could hear my mother sobbing. I took a quick glance and saw my father with his hand on her shoulder. "I'm sure he doesn't mean it," my father said, trying to console my mother. "I'll talk to him tomorrow after he's had some time to cool off." My father did try to talk to me in the morning, but I wasn't interested in patching things up with my mother. I had said what I meant and meant what I said. In my mind, she had never been there for me, so it was no loss. All these years later, I still haven't talked to her. The divorce went through, and my father's assessment was correct. My mother was entitled to very little, but bitterness had filled my father regarding his ex-wife. He fought her for the little she was entitled to until the lawyer bills exceeded that, and my mother eventually abandoned the fight. That was one of the very rare happy days for my father. Tanya chose to live with my mother, and I stayed on the ranch. My father wasn't upset initially that my sister had decided to live with her mother. He sort of expected it, but when she spoke against him at one of the divorce hearings, that all changed. After that day, my father never talked to Tanya or about her again. I don't think Tanya was ever truly happy living with Mom. She never said anything uncomplimentary about her mother, but I know she was devastated that Dad had cut her off. The few times we talked, Tanya would ask me to have Dad call her. He never did. I knew that both Tanya and my dad were hurting, but I couldn't help either of them. This was more fallout caused by my mother's actions. When Tanya graduated from college and got married, I wasn't invited to either event. I didn't understand why, and it upset me. I stopped talking to Tanya after that. I'm now in a disagreement with her over the ranch, and I'm afraid she's going to win. She wants to sell everything, and I don't. It's complicated with the trust, no will, my aunts and uncles, and my father's disappearance. I've been managing everything in my father's absence. About a week after I took over, I discovered that my father's brothers and sisters had given him half of their shares years ago, believing that since my father was doing all the work, he should receive the majority. My father owned 60% of everything. With my father now declared dead, the lawyers informed me that if I wanted to keep the ranch, my sister and I would have to raise a significant amount of money to pay the taxes. This is the main reason my sister wants to sell everything. she and her husband don't have the funds to pay the taxes and don't want to go into debt to save the ranch. What surprised me was that my father didn't seem to have any estate planning in place. He was usually a meticulous planner, so discovering there was no will was shocking. Now, the state will decide how everything will be divided, creating a complicated situation. After the divorce, Tuck and my mother married within a month. True to Tuck's character, he bought a large piece of land right across the road from the ranch and had a huge house built on it. He did this so my father would see it every time he drove out the front gate. Once the divorce was final, my father retreated into his work, which was the only thing that seemed to give him pleasure. While I was still living with him, he would sit on the front porch for hours, staring into space. His heart was broken, and he felt crushed. His anger towards Tuck was consuming him. Tuck continued to flaunt his new life, making sure my father saw him with my mother. There was no doubt that Tuck enjoyed rubbing it in my father's face. Tuck's taunting got so bad that my father began limiting his trips to town and skipping social functions. One thing my father remained deeply involved with was the Cattlemen's Association, a special interest group protecting the rights of cattlemen. My father had been chairman for 2 years and was serving his third and final term. During this third year, Tuck joined the association and was quickly elected to the board, forcing my father to interact with him at every meeting. Tuck always brought my mother with him, and she seemed to take pleasure in humiliating my father. My mother and Tuck were married for about 1.5 years before things took a turn for the worse. I couldn't understand my father's actions or my mother's. It felt like the world had been turned upside down. "Mr. Stanton," a voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to find the bank manager standing next to me. "We've verified the court order, and I can take you to your father's safe deposit box now. I assume you'd like a private room to examine the contents?" "Yes, please," I answered, getting to my feet. The manager led me into the vault, collected the box, and then into a private room. The room was small but had a counter and a chair. Once the door was closed, I locked it and placed the box on the counter. I opened it to find 2 large envelopes and a smaller letter-sized envelope on top. I opened the smaller envelope first and found a handwritten letter from my father. I recognized his handwriting immediately. "Dear Jake, I am so sorry to have left you without a word. However, there was nothing I could do about that. Time was short and you were out of town. Besides, it was best that you didn't know, as I am sure you would have tried to stop me. My decision to leave was of my own free will and I won't ever be returning." The 2 other envelopes in this box contain the complete story of what happened to me and my last will and testament. The will is notarized, and there is a business card for the law firm that prepared it. When you read my story, you might think I've lost my mind, but believe me, every word is the truth. When you read this, you can assume that I am alive, but please don't tell anyone, not even your wife, where I have gone. No one will ever be able to find me. After you read my story, you'll understand why. In my story, I have asked you to do a few things for me. I know they will be difficult, but I beg you to honor my requests. I can't truly atone for what I've done, but if you agree to do what I ask, I believe it will help relieve some of the suffering I have caused. I am deeply ashamed by my actions. Do not worry about me, I am content and at peace with where I am going. My only regret is that I will never see you or your sister again. I always tried to be a good father, but I know that I failed. I want you to know that I was always proud of you and loved you deeply, as much as any father could love his son. I also loved your sister dearly. Despite everything, even if you don't believe my story, please do the small favors I've asked, they would mean a lot to me. I have caused a lot of damage, and I love you beyond words. I dropped my father's note on the counter and sat back in my chair. I was beyond shocked. My father was still alive, where could he have gone? In today's world, no one can hide forever, but I had already spent a small fortune on private investigators trying to locate him with no success. I was puzzled and troubled by my father's remorse. What had he done that he wanted to make amends for? I reviewed the 2 years before my father disappeared and couldn't find any fault with him despite the craziness that happened. So many emotions and thoughts filled me, perhaps the overriding feeling was total happiness that my dad was still alive. I didn't believe for a second that he couldn't be found. I would begin again by hiring the best private investigators money could buy. This time, I felt they had a real shot at locating him. It troubled me that my father felt he had done something so wrong. I glanced quickly into each of the large envelopes and then pulled out his story. Jake, if you're reading this, then I've been gone for 7 years. As I mentioned in my note, please don't tell anyone that I am alive. Explaining where I have gone will be nearly impossible. I know as you read this, you will find what I have to say hard to believe, but everything in this story is accurate. The way the story is written may seem strange, but I will explain why. You already know the history between your mother, Tuck, and me, so I won't go over it again. Suffice to say that when your mother left me for Tuck, I was devastated. Losing your mother to any man would have been catastrophic, but losing her to someone I despised pushed me to the edge. I went into a very dark place and wanted revenge on both of them. That anger twisted me in ways I wasn't aware of and led me to actions I deeply regret. For these actions, I beg for your forgiveness. However, if you cannot forgive me after reading this, I will understand. I will still love you profoundly and hope that you still harbor some small affection for me. Although I accept the total blame for my actions, Ashley and Tuck are not blameless. They went out of their way to torment me, and Tuck rubbed my face in my loss while Ashley supported him in this. I think she may have enjoyed it, but I no longer care. I do admit that our divorce battle was not my finest moment. I should have just let Ashley have the amount she was entitled to, but I was consumed by hate. Despite that, I was still in love with your mother and yearned for revenge. My reason for leaving began about 6 months before I actually left, starting on the night of a severe storm that knocked out electricity for hours. I sent you home to your new wife shortly before the storm intensified, and your rented house flooded. With no electricity, I got out the lanterns and flashlights, poured myself a drink, and settled into my recliner. Around midnight, while sipping on my drink and listening to a jazz station on the radio, I felt the house shake briefly. I thought it was an earthquake, but it didn't last. I decided to ignore it and continue resting. About an hour later, I felt I should go to bed since I wanted to be up early for work. As I headed for the staircase, I heard something on the front porch. The wind was blowing, so I thought something might have been blown down. To my utter shock, I found a woman lying just to the left of the front door. She was cut and bleeding, also she was only semi-conscious. I guess the alcohol had dulled my brain because I only took passing notice of her clothing. She appeared to be wearing an aquacolor jumpsuit, but my attention was immediately focused on her wounds. She was cut up pretty badly, which is why I probably didn't pay too much attention to her appearance. The woman also had a lump on her forehead the size of a golf ball, and because of the limited lighting, I didn't pay much attention to the seemingly strange bronze color of her skin. In the dim light of my flashlight, she appeared to have gray hair, yet she seemed to be a young woman. After helping her into the guest bedroom, I assessed her wounds. At the time, I thought some of them might be serious. In any event, I told her that the cuts needed to be cleaned and bandaged. I motioned what I intended to do and explained at the same time. She said in a strange accent, "Amen." I didn't recognize the language, but I didn't see how she could tend the cuts by herself if that's what she meant. This mystery woman could barely move. I examined her wounds and had to admit that there were only a few on her back and they were minor. It was just some of the ones on her legs and stomach that seemed severe. Still, it made no sense for her to try and bandage herself. "I don't think so. You can barely move." "I'll do it," I said. She shook her head. "You can't do it," she replied with exasperation. "Look, if you don't want me to do it, I'll take you to a hospital or call a doctor." "Nay, doctor," she said, shaking her head. "Okay, I understand," I said, even though I didn't. "You don't want me to help you, and you don't want a doctor to help. What are we going to do?" I also pointed to her bleeding cuts and raised hands, shrugging my shoulders to indicate my confusion at her refusal. "Need tool," she said, pleading. "What tool?" I asked, totally perplexed. She pointed through the window out the front of the house. "Tool there? You want me to go out there?" I pointed out the same window she had indicated. "You want me to go out in the rain? I won't be able to find anything in the dark." Even before I finished objecting, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something the shape of a woman's compact. "This tool help," the mystery woman offered it to me. I took the object and realized it had a red light running from the center of the device out toward the edge. The direction that the light flowed was toward that front window. I figured it must be some kind of GPS, but I had never seen anything like it. "Please find tool," she was pleading now. "Blue, find blue." The woman began to lose consciousness at that point, but the pleading in her eyes penetrated deep within me. Yet despite her protestations to the contrary, I decided to call for an ambulance instead. But my cell phone provided no service. I would learn in the morning that several cell towers had been damaged by the storm. Next, I picked up the landline, but it was also useless. I was about to load her into my truck and haul her to the hospital, but a thought suddenly struck me. What if there were other injured people out there? She didn't appear to be in imminent danger, so I put towels over the worst wounds to stem the bleeding and tucked the blanket around her. Taking her device, I headed out. The wind was dying down by this point and the rain had turned to a light drizzle. I let the device guide me. It led me down the drive, out the front gate to the main road. I turned left and traveled for less than a couple of minutes before I could barely see something smoldering off the road, about 500 feet away. In truth, if I hadn't had the GPS, I would have missed it completely. At first, I thought maybe a small airplane had crashed, but the field was too small even for a single-engine plane. It must have been a car crash. When I got closer, it didn't seem like fires were burning. It was more like the debris was evaporating in shimmering red light. Of course, I had had the better part of 5 stiff drinks, so I took everything I saw with a grain of salt. In truth, I probably shouldn't have been driving in my condition. As I got out of the truck, the fires began to die out. Still, there was the shell of something. I assumed it was perhaps a car, and from the size, I thought it was probably a sports car. But I wasn't there to check out the wreckage. I was looking for survivors and her blue tool. I quickly combed the area for any other survivors of this crash. From the vehicle size, I knew there could only be one other potential victim. After a quick search, I was convinced there was no one else. Then I turned my attention to finding the tool. It only took about a minute of hunting when I saw the first blue object. It seemed to be glowing, but when I picked it up, whatever lighting there was disappeared. It was roughly the size and shape of a baseball. Then I saw another blue object. This one had dimensions similar to a hardbound dictionary. A few feet away was another, the size of a small paperback book. The fourth blue object I found looked like a laptop computer. The fifth and final one was about the size of a golf ball. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your like.